Good morning. Welcome to our 2022 State of Flux Summit. My name's Nick Heiner, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our virtual launch of our research. We're hugely disappointed that we can't see you all in person. Obviously, the combination of train strikes and tube strikes meant that we had to make the decision to make it virtual, and we want to say a huge thank you to Goldman Sachs, who were due to host us. And you know, for all their flexibility in the last few weeks. But we're virtual. We've still got the same fantastic speakers for you, and we think, you know, that you're going to be able to get the content and get the ideas in exactly the same way. And we're going to do our best to keep you guys involved. To do that, we're going to run a question function, which you'll see in your GoToWebinar. So please add questions to what's going on. We will, if we don't get to the questions during this morning, we will follow up on every question, and so make sure that you get the value from this session. The research is going to be launched today, and when you've filled in the feedback form, you're going to be able to access the research. Thank you to everyone that's taken part. We've had over 300 global companies take part in the research, so it gives us another fantastic insight this year into supply management and how this is developing in what is a pretty turbulent time, which is why we chose this topic of resilience, and we think it's one that resonates. I'm going to be your MC today for this packed event, and looking forward to it. Before we start, just a quick reflection really on what I and the team have heard over the last 12 months from different companies in different industries. We've heard from healthcare companies that have had to create a completely local supply chain because of resilience. They've had to change that from a global supply chain. We've spoken to construction companies that have had to completely change the way that they do contracting. No more fixed pricing, having to refer to spot prices and raw materials because of just the sheer change in that raw material pricing. I spoke to suppliers this week, huge users of power that have gone from daily bills, utility and energy bills, hundreds of thousands to millions. And we've also seen a huge growth in renewable energy clients. So we're working with wind electricity, with batteries, with nuclear, and with hydrogen power. And this is, we're seeing this change. We're seeing this change in in industries. So yes, there's lots of disruption, but we're also seeing tons of opportunity. And we think supply chain and dealing with the disruption in it is as big a topic as it's ever been. So we're really excited about today. So let me introduce you to the team that we've got here to talk to you. So we've got Simon Cox, who is the ex-CPO of easyJet and is now director of all in-flight retail. He's going to be our keynote speaker and is going to give an insight into what resilience means, I guess, in the airline industry. Alan Day, who I thought many of you know, my boss, founder of State of Flux. He's going to talk through the research and just give some insights to that. Richard Blore, who's CEO and Managing Director at KY3P at S&P Global. Richard has a fascinating insight because he was global head of supply chain at Goldman Sachs, and so has seen both sides, from being both a vendor and being a consumer. We're really excited to have Dan White, who's a former elite soldier, to give an entirely different perspective on resilience and how to prepare teams for it. And then finally, we've also got David Wiley, who's a CPO of Thames Water, literally having to react to the daily climate and all the challenges that brings. So we're fantastically thankful for the guys for joining us and looking forward to it. In terms of agenda, we've got welcome introductions just done. As I said, Simon's doing the keynote, Alan's on research, Richard's going to talk about using data to build resilience in his role at S&P Global. Dan's going to talk about how to build resilience in teams. Then we're going to have a panel discussion. Again, we'd love your questions. Please submit questions, and then we're going to have closing with Alan. So trying to keep everything to time so that you're not in front of the screens for too long. So let me invite Simon Cox to to take us through his keynote, What Does Resilience Mean in Organisations? Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Nick, and welcome everybody. Really delighted to be with you today. Nick and Alan invited me to speak actually halfway through the summer, and I did think, why would anybody want to hear from Simon and from easyJet? But of course, easyJet's an organisation that's never more than a couple of days from being on the front page of the newspapers. It's in the forefront of people's minds, the ability to travel, and it's something we take for granted in our day-to-day lives, and it's something that we've missed over the last couple of years. So it seems kind of natural. In fact, I've been working in the business for 25 years. So I guess the other reason might be that I might be described as an industry veteran, or I might have some battle scars that would be useful when we're talking about resilience. So I love this industry. Moreover, I love working for easyJet. I've worked for them for 9 years, and so I want to share some of that, what resilience means about and how that's built into our business model, how it's built into our people, and crucially for this audience, how that then flows through and how we progress with our partnerships. So I want to start with a controversial thought, that as much as I love this industry, it is an absolutely lousy industry to be in, and would not be recommended. And just to back that up, don't take my word for it, take the word of the world's greatest investor, Warren Buffett. He has been completely clear on his view as to why the airline business is a terrible business, and I'll leave you to read those quotes, but it's summed up about how difficult a business this is and how poorly served shareholders have been, even to the extent that he would like to wind back the clock 120 years to Kitty Hawk, and believes that capitalism would be better served if they'd have actually prevented the Wright brothers from taking off. So it's a pretty lousy business to be in. We employ millions of people worldwide, and yet over the years we have presided over an incredible creation of wealth for our suppliers and supply chain, and done a lousy job of taking that value to ourselves. So customers have benefited from what airlines do, but shareholders haven't. People in our supply chain equally so. So as a provocation, this is a lousy business to be in, or so you would have thought. So come 1992, 90 years after having flown, the sum total of profits in the whole of the airline industry was precisely zero. So why would anybody get into this business? We get into the mid-90s and Europe is beginning to open up, and Stelios launches easyJet, and the whole marketing ploy was to make flying affordable as a pair of jeans. So back in the day, that pair of jeans was a pair of Levi Volvo ones. They were $29.99. The last time I had a quick look, even before the ravages of this year's inflation, they're at around £100. To give you some sort of perspective, we started at £29, and that box in the middle was an article run by The Sun after we'd been flying for 20 years, and the price had actually reduced. So actually, this model has been incredibly resilient. It's been incredibly compelling. It's gone from taking, one domestic flight from Luton to Glasgow to carrying over 100 million passengers a year. So from humble beginnings, it has grown and become a day-to-day staple of our, the way we think about travel. We started by offering direct sales through telephone lines. We were the first to embrace the web, and therefore we've remained at the forefront of the industry and the way that people think about travel. So if this is maybe a change, let's have a look at really how our business model works and why it is so much more resilient. So easyJet as an airline is genuinely pan-European. We compete with both legacy airlines as well as low cost, and importantly, we fly to the places that people want to fly to with frequency and the proposition that people value. One interesting point here is that, as I talked about, airlines have been lousy at making money. But if you look, as we came into the COVID crisis, there were only 3 airlines in the world with an investment grade rating. And if you look at those on the bottom left, they were Ryanair and easyJet in the European space and Southwest in the US, which tells you this is the resilient business model. It's the one that's proven to be the most resilient to produce the shareholder returns. And I just want to share with you how that's done. And in effect, this is the world's worst kept secret. There are no secrets within the airline industry about how you deploy your model and how that ends up being a more resilient proposition. So if I take the bits of the business I'm responsible for, that is a profit center. So anything that you buy on board is a genuinely retail proposition, and obviously we make a profit on that. In a legacy airline, that is a cost center. So any free product that is given, a lot of logistics costs behind that, and that becomes a cost drag on that particular business. And then there's the simplicity of the model. So we avoid involving third parties like travel agents and global distribution systems. We use one type of aircraft, and that helps reduce our cost. It creates bigger, more substantive relationships with our suppliers, and it also means when we go to airports, we're able to offer volumes and growth, and that's been the kind of hallmark of low-cost travel, a model that reinforces itself through good times and bad. As we all expect, we will be going into some form of recession over the coming years. But having the lowest cost production, having a network that is flexible and can be moved, and having the ability to flex your capital and lower your price structure is absolutely key in being a resilient organization. And I'm aware that maybe some of my competitors are even on the line, but I would argue that that competitive cost base, the flexibility that is able to weather any particular recession or crises that we may have. And the stat on the bottom right just takes us back to the last significant crisis. And actually, where others saw threat, easyJet saw opportunity, and we were able to grow market share. We actually grew our capacity despite the kind of recessionary environment. And more importantly, we grew profitably. So the business model is absolutely the core strength of what easyJet is about, and it's why since the mid-90s actually the low-cost model has shown itself to be the most resilient, the most profitable, and as we look into the next 10 years will outstrip legacy growth going forward. So that's kind of an important background into why resilience is absolutely built into easyJet and what we do. So if the business model is resilient, maybe the next place to look would be, well, what about the people? Yeah, how resilient can you be with your people, and how's that built in? So if I might ask everybody just to think yourselves on maybe one of our flights, put yourself in your favorite seat, maybe with a gin and tonic, and you're flying to your favorite holiday destination, and the captain comes on and says, look, unfortunately we have a problem, but don't worry, because we've been trained in this particular scenario. I was only in the simulator last week and we're having this under control, so we have a particular malfunction with the engine, but don't worry, I've been trained in this, and you carry on. I'm assuming that everybody would feel pretty reassured, and you should do, and our pilots are trained to the highest standards. But let's imagine that we were facing a situation that the pilot had not faced before, and there's a situation, a crisis that is not fully understood. And let's face it, that is the more likely scenario, both on the flight deck, but also for management teams. The scenario and the crisis that you've planned for is unlikely to be the one that confronts you And that is actually why we now train our pilots not to deal with individual scenarios that they may or may not come across, an engine shutdown, and of course they can deal with that. But actually, emphasis is on communication, on teamwork, and to understand the situation as it arises and the most appropriate actions to take in order to mitigate against it. And I think that's an excellent metaphor for how we approach crises and how we build resilience into our people. So if I was just to look maybe at some of the crises that we've faced in the past, and if I could just ask John to move the slide on, just reflecting that no two crises are ever the same. You know, I've been, as I said, in this industry long enough to see some self-inflicted crises. Worked at British Airways with a cabin crew strike. I've seen some supplier failures well in my time at easyJet. But what is interesting about the external crises as we face them, they do offer absolute opportunity. So if I just wind ourselves back to the terrible events of 9/11, I was working for British Airways, and it was a genuine threat to our very existence. So that management team was absolutely preoccupied with survival. And yet the same crisis, looked at from the view of Michael O'Leary and Ryanair, was the world's greatest opportunity that he had ever seen. So while facing decreased demands, Michael O'Leary got himself on a flight to Seattle, placed the world's biggest order with Boeing, and grew the airline. He knew that the model was strong enough that he could lower fares, stimulate demand, and people still wanted to travel. And when you look over the long term, people do want to travel, and there are ways to navigate through that crisis. But I think it's an interesting perspective when you're thinking about how to be resilient. A, that crises do offer opportunity, and secondly, every crisis looks different depending on from where you are standing. And the airline industry, you know, those that have been most successful have taken advantage to the greatest possible extent of a crisis. So that is kind of context to where we found ourselves you know, over the last couple of years during a COVID crisis in which we've had to ground the fleet. I think the management team have absolutely sought to seek opportunity. But, and here comes the big but, you know, we have challenges that we've not fully seen coming. And if we just wind on to the next slide, we can see the one that happened to us in easyJet, because we've been proud of our growth, is we found ourselves in a situation that our founder and biggest shareholder came out against the board and against the growth that was being proposed. That very business model we built, the opportunities we built, and then we were in conflict to the extent, very publicly, we had Stelios calling our CEO an overpaid tour rep, which clearly from a management point of view is not ideal. The reason I raise this is because during any crises, there will be unexpected turn of events. But I'm delighted to say we've worked our way through that. We have got the order with Airbus, and we've kind of moved forward. But management teams need to be prepared to deal with that. And again, if we just go back to what builds resilience in people in easyJet, I think it does go back to that pilot training mentality. Willing to take action, but knowing that communication and situational awareness is the key. And we've seen that, whether that's dealing with our shareholders, whether that's dealing with our partners or our people. And often we refer to that internally as our orange spirit, the ability to go the extra mile and really be invested in what the company's doing. So if I've covered, hopefully, why easyJet is resilient and why the business model is resilient and why our people are resilient and why we build that into what we do, then maybe the third pillar of this is to understand, well, how do you deal with your partners? And as Nick said, you know, previously being CPO at easyJet, what I've seen is as we've grown up, we used to be a market taker, lowest price over everything. Well, you get big, you get to scale. We're now, I think, the world's 7th largest airline by passenger numbers. Then you all of a sudden have more ability, but more responsibility in order to form more balanced relationships, both balanced from the partner's perspective, but also balanced from our perspective about how much control we need. So I thought I'd share kind of 3 perspectives about how you build resilience into these relationships with examples, because there's no one size fits all. We don't outsource everything to the greatest extent necessarily. We don't necessarily insource, but we take a really considered view on what's happening. So if I take a general trend in each and every one of the relationships we're forming in the key parts of our business, we are taking more control over how that's deployed, the customer proposition. Great example of that is the business we're in, new partnership with Donata. That's great if people exist in the marketplace, but what happens when those people in the marketplace aren't able to meet the needs? Well, easyJet as an organisation more than willing to put the risk and the time and the effort into bringing new entrants. So we brought DHL into the ground handling market a few years ago. Why did we do that? Because handling is a logistics exercise. We brought people with logistics expertise rather than just bringing a body shop to the table. And where that doesn't exist, we're more than happy to take the decision to bring that expertise in-house, and we've done that with engineering. And then the third approach is, look, where do we genuinely want to disrupt the world? Where can we use that mindset we had back in 1995 to disrupt the marketplace? And we're currently doing that with holidays, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the reason why I raised these 3 approaches is I think they all have something in common. We have an increasing willingness to get involved and to share the risk. So whether that's take on the risk ourselves by doing it ourselves, or whether that's increasing the risk by developing new entrants or sharing the risk with third parties, I think as a growing organisation and an increasingly large organisation, that is how we build resilience in. We take our fair share of the risk and we put in more effort into being really clear on requirements. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples that were on there. So the first one I'd like to talk about is easyJet Holidays. Effectively, we're doing to the holidays market what we did to the airline market in 1995. If easyJet as an airline already flies 100 million passengers, then we don't need to build an airline to take the people on holiday. TUI, with the greatest respect, run a very expensive airline operation to feed their hotels, some of which they've actually built themselves. So it's hugely capital intensive. We're not taking the capital intensive. This is a light touch model. And just to give you some sort of idea, this was launched just prior to COVID, and I think we're now the 3rd largest tour operator in the UK, and will be making profits of around 35 million pounds. So from nothing, willing to invest during the period of crisis to achieve a great outcome. So great flexibility, true market disruption. The next example, which is close to home for myself, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but say I look after in-flight retail. It's a retail environment like no other. Most retailers would kill to put you in their shop as a captive audience for 3 hours, and yet we don't show you the produce. This is not a digital environment. So our great thrust in taking this on, again, putting in the effort during a point of crisis to invest in this, is to say, right, we can transform what is a very traditional retail environment on board, actually make this a genuinely e-commerce environment, whether that should be ordering to your seat via your own device or whether that's pre-order. This is a big project for us, again, to drive huge amounts of profitability. But we're not disrupting, we're keeping to the core of our business model and our people. And anybody who's travelled on easyJet, I hope, will recognise that one of the great things about flying on easyJet is how friendly and such a warm welcome from our crew, and we need to develop that and make sure that that flows through in sales. So hopefully that's just a couple of examples of where we're willing to take risk, we're willing to put in the effort in order to achieve results. So, and that applies across whichever partnership that we are doing. And then, so if I just kind of take maybe the last minute to wrap up and summarize. The first point, it was deliberately the first point, resilience is built into our DNA through our business model. Without that, history has shown it is going to be very difficult to be resilient, and you're constantly going to be reactive if you're, if you don't have an investment grade, if you're not able to invest for the future. So that is absolutely key. The second thing is, how do we use that kind of orange spirit and build resilience into our DNA? And I hope in sharing how we train our pilots and how we've navigated our way through a crisis, it demonstrates how it's built into our people. One thing you would notice if you ever went into our office is just how few people there are, and that keeping that tight and controlled management team is absolutely key. And then kind of creating a kind of segue for the rest of the discussion that we'll be having from the other panelists and the report that Alan and Nick have provided. How do you build resilience in your partnership? So for us, it's about leveraging the brand, taking the appropriate amount of risk to embrace partners, and doing it ourselves if that's what it takes. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into the world of easyJet. I hope that stimulated a few questions. Look forward to hearing more from people when we get to that. But until then, thank you very much, and back to Nick.
Brilliant, thank you, Simon. That's fascinating, and it's always good to see when someone has moved from procurement into effectively sales. And I did note that Simon was trying to get us all to imagine a gin and tonic on our easyJet flight, and I'm sure that's one of his highest margin products. So thank you, Simon, and look forward to the questions that that come through. So next up, we have Alan Day, and Alan's my boss, and as you probably know, Alan operates in basically three or four continents at any one time, flipping between Australia, US, and Europe. So in some ways that's good, but actually you never know when Alan's going to turn up on a call. You never quite know which time zone he's in, whether that's one that works or not. So if he gets a bit sleepy during this, we'll just turn him off, and someone will call him and wake him up. But I think he's quite fresh, having been here for a week. So Alan, looking forward to hearing the insights, and yeah, looking forward to hearing it.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, and I'll make sure I do keep surprising you at 2 AM occasionally. No, hugely appreciated, and huge thank you to Simon. Absolutely fascinating, and I know from our experience with working with easyJet, they're fantastic to partner with. I have worried about this orange spirit, though. What comes to mind is Aperol Spritz, but anyway, that's perhaps for later in the day. I'm going to start with a few thank yous, because these reports do not happen without your input. So to everyone on the call, and I think we're well over 200 attendees today, so hugely appreciated. But I know we tell you that our surveys, every year we tell you it takes 20 minutes. And if we told you it took longer, you probably wouldn't do it. But we do know that it takes between half an hour and 40 minutes. So huge thank you for taking that time. It is book number 14. And we know that it doesn't exist without you taking the time to do the survey. Now, on saying that, if you've done the survey, one of the thank yous we give you is a free benchmark of your results versus everyone else, and we're now over 3 million data points over the 14 years. So please take the time to get your benchmark. All you have to do is book it in with the team, and we'll happily give you feedback on how you're doing and where are the potential opportunities to improve. And I'm going to spend some time on that in a few minutes. The other big thank you I need to make is to Caroline Alonso and the team at Goldman Sachs. I was so looking forward to seeing you all in person. I can't tell you how disappointed we are that we're not in person, but in true resilient style, we've switched to online and we're making the most of it. So thank you. The positive is that we've got a lot more of you online, so thank you for also adjusting with us, and we hugely appreciate it. So a big thank you. And then the last thank you before I get into some of the results is to my own team for all their hard work. Writing these books is a bit like a marathon. We start at the beginning of the year in January. We come up with a theme, we come up with the question sets, and then we hassle you for completing the survey before writing it up and doing case studies, etc. So it is like a marathon. By the time the guys get to this point, they're sort of saying, we'll never do this again. And then funnily enough, they're lining up at the start point in January again. So huge thank you to my team around the globe that have put in a massive amount of effort into this year's book. And I'm sure you will love it when you get it in your hands. Yeah, much appreciated. Can we just flick to the next slide, please, John? So this year's book, we've got, it's a slim 111 pages of insights and a number of case studies. We've been lucky enough, and again, another thank you, to have the book sponsored this year by S&P Global. So for Richard and his team, we've hugely appreciated that. And they are also a case study in this year's book, along with people like Telstra, Air Products, Kellogg's. So most of these you will recognise in terms of brands. You'll hear from David later on in terms of Thames Water. Prescio you possibly haven't heard of, but I'm sure you will soon. They are a sustainable athletic wear company doing some really disruptive stuff. Think of a high performance athlete brand, but similar to Lululemon. So yeah, very cool. So we've got some cool case studies from the incredibly large organizations like Chevron to Prescio. I'm not planning on going through each of those case studies. When you get the books, which you will do, spend the time to have a look at them. But this year, as I said, there's more case studies than we've ever had before, so we're really excited about that, and more data in that 111 pages. So please enjoy. Next slide, please. We're getting there. John, could you? Yeah, thank you. So the insights from around the globe, as Nick mentioned, we've had over 300 companies participate, which is pretty much in line with what we get each year. These are complete survey responses, so we get a lot more partial ones, and we completely appreciate that it does take more than the 20 minutes we tell you it takes. But yeah, some really interesting insights. We've had a lot more respondents from Australasia and a few more from America, actually. So we are seeing those areas grow. We're still not seeing much. They're really not hitting the radar in South America, Middle East, or Africa. What we're really finding is you've got to be reasonably mature in procurement to start embracing supplier management. However, when we go to the next slide in a few seconds, we'll see that that the results still have lots of opportunity, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that as we go through. So if you're familiar, and hopefully most of you are, the survey and the consequent books are all divided into what we call the 6 pillars of SRM. And we know over the years of doing this, and I'm sorry for those people who've heard me talk about this in the past, but I will run quickly through what those 6 pillars are. And we know from doing this for nearly 20 years that you've got to work on all 6 pillars to make the program work. You can't work on, and this is the most common mistake procurement makes, you can't work on process and governance and expect that you'll have an SRM program. The key thing here is to make SRM work, it needs to be a business change program led by procurement, not a procurement change program. There is an absolute reason why we've got Simon Cox as our keynote speaker, because he's in the business, he's a key business stakeholder. We have an added bonus that he's got a procurement background, but to make SRM work in easyJet, it needed to be a business change program. And that is something that we as procurement really need to embrace, because I'm going to show you in a couple of slides time where we are in terms of our global results, and we've got plenty of improvement. So to just quickly run through the 6 pillars. So value, what we're looking for is, firstly, have we defined what value is for your organization? And not only what value is, but what is supplier management? So before you can even get to the value, have we actually defined what supplier management means? And we see a real range when we talk to clients, ranging from performance management, risk management, if you're in financial services. Some people think it's harder negotiations. Some people think it's a golf game with the supplier. What we need to get is, for our organization, there is a consistent view, and especially in procurement, we're able to articulate what that value is and what is supply management, so that our stakeholders actually understand what we're doing. So the first part is understanding value and defining it, then having a process to capture and measure that value, and then finally we look for, are you actually achieving value in your program? And a couple of points here on value. For the 14 years that we've been doing the research, the hard numbers that we've seen have remained relatively consistent. Generally, it ranges between 3 and 6% hard benefit for leaders in SRM. So that's benefit over and above what you've contracted with your supplier. What has grown over the time is what we call the customer of choice benefits. So this is, we know that if you're good at supplier management, you're twice as likely to get access to the A team. You're twice as likely to get access to scarce resource. You're twice as likely to get preferential pricing. You're 3 times as likely to get access to innovation. And the real kicker for me, 5 times likely to get faster speed to market for new products and services. So unbelievable value coming from that. The challenge is that those customer of choice benefits are much harder to measure. Now, there is a third element, and again, this has been quite consistent. And again, this is tricky, but this is that we know between 30 and 50% of all deals done don't hit the bottom line without strong supplier management. So think about that for a minute. Between 30 and 50% of all the procurement deals that you're doing, so between 1/3 and 1/2, are not hitting the bottom line, are frankly a waste of time, which is pretty scary. So value, incredibly important. I've spent way too long on it, and I'll get told off in a minute. But yeah, that's kind of 101. And I should point out that these 6 are in order. So the next thing that we see is people aren't engaging it. So I mentioned that to get SRM working, which is different to strat sourcing and category management, it's a business change program. We need the business engaged. We need the business aligned when we're dealing with suppliers, because let's face it, most of the time the supplier is interacting with our operational stakeholders, not with us. So if they are not singing to the same tune as us, then we've got a problem. So we look at engagement in a number of levels. We look at stakeholder engagement. So your operational stakeholders, do they understand what is SRM, and are they engaged in it? We look at executive engagement. Do you have not only sponsors for your key relationships, do you have a sponsor for your program? And are they active? Because we don't want just a endorsement, we want an active sponsorship. And we know from the research that your sponsor needs to be as close to CEO as possible to make it work. And the third area of engagement, and it's funny, people forget it, but absolutely critical, is your suppliers are a key stakeholder in your program. So if you haven't measured whether you're a customer of choice with your key suppliers, please take this as a kind of verbal kick in the right direction, but make sure you measure whether you're a customer of choice with your key suppliers, and if not, how do you become a better customer? So that's engagement. Governance, and this is, as I said, often people jump straight to this, and that is a problem. Really, we need to define the value, get the business engaged before we do things like segmentation, developing treatment strategies, pulling together processes, policies, procedures, and so on. And I can go on for a long time around some of the challenges there, but just to think about it, in the survey, around about 98% of people tell us they do segmentation. When we look at how they do segmentation, most people do it on spend, and if we're lucky, criticality. The good programs are using about 15 different criteria: access to innovation, access to sustainability, to insights, and also what do they see, or how do they view you as a key customer? Do they see you as a strategic customer, or do they see you as a cash cow? So get segmentation right, and then develop your treatment strategies. And the other piece is do it with the business, which is why we need to engage them earlier on. So for me, governance is critical, and that segmentation becomes your engine there. From there, we look at, what are kind of the org charts, and it leads us nicely into the people, because we can then look at the mapping of the two organizations or the multiple organizations that you've got, looking at the roles and responsibilities, job descriptions, and I'm not talking procurement here, I'm talking the wider business. If they're doing supply management activities as part of their job, might only be 5% of their job, where is it in their job description? Are they measured on it? Does their boss look for it? Is their bonus tied to it? And then have we done a competency assessment, and have we trained them? And as I said, not just procurement, our horizon needs to be the wider business as well, and the suppliers. We can train our suppliers, and the leading organizations do train their suppliers. Technology, what we look for here is things like contract performance, so contract management, performance management, and it's amazing how, I'm sorry guys, poor we are as an industry on supplier performance management. We really need to sort that out as an industry. Relationship management, so how do we run 360s, do joint account plans, and simple things like mapping the interactions and tracking the interactions with the supplier. We look for supplier risk management, supplier innovation management, sustainability, and onboarding. So those are the 7 things we look for when we're running the research. And then finally, collaboration is really an output, but this is where the joint account planning and 360 reviews come together, and we're looking at value, what we call value release. So I've spent far too long on that, but hopefully for those of you who are not familiar with it, you understand the methodology behind it. As I said, it is in order. And the next slide, if we could go to that now, will show you our results as an industry. So you'll see, and the reason I'm being quite, let's call it dictatorial, is that our percentage of leaders is woeful. So I'm sorry guys, I'm going to deliver some hard messages here, and after 14 years, I think I've earned the right to deliver some hard messages. But as an industry, we need to sort out supply management. We need to increase that. Now, that isn't, we don't take an arbitrary line. To be a leader, you have to be in the established banding. So if you look closely at the graph, you'll see that there's some lines and you've got on the left-hand side underdeveloped, developing, established, and advanced. So to be a leader, you have to be in that established banding for 4 of your 6 pillars. To be a fast follower for 3 of your 6 pillars. So look, the criteria isn't even that challenging, and yet we've only got 9% of companies in that. Now, the red line is where we are as Europe. I think the positive here is Europe does sort of lead on where we are in supply management. And what's interesting is over the last 13 prior years, technology was the worst scoring pillar. All of a sudden, it is now the best scoring pillar. So the digital age is here, and I've got my next slide does describe that. So yeah, we are seeing some good investment in technology, but look, the second worst and now the worst has been people. Our investment in people has been pretty poor. And as I said, collaboration is an output. So unless we get the other 5 right, we're not going to get the value and the collaboration coming out of it. So again, getting that kind of, I mentioned, if you haven't got your kind of customer of choice measure for your suppliers, the other bit that I would say is train your people. You really need to train your people. So if we could just flick to the next slide, I just want to drill down a little bit in technology now. As I said, we're seeing an increase in use of technology tools by over 50%. But on the flip side of it, only 10% of you are saying that the tools are fit for purpose. And when we drill into that, what that's telling us is, and what we're seeing is that people are using ERP tools or purchase to pay tools for supply management, and they're not designed for supply management. You know, a survey tool is not a KPI and performance management tool. So guys, I think one of the things, firstly, you know, I mentioned only 9% of us are in the leader group. I think the key thing here is if you think you're good at supply management, take a step back, because you're probably not, I'm sorry to say. And from there, you can then say, well, are we using the right tools, the processes, policies, procedures? Because I think what we're trying to do is race to a solution without actually making it a business change program. So, you know, for me, trying to use a non-fit for purpose tool is just going to lead us down a path of disaster, and it's not sustainable. So yeah, the good thing is we are investing in technology. The challenge is we've got to make sure it is the right technology, and it is supply management technology, as opposed to trying to use other tools that you might be using for your rec to pay or purchase to pay. Next slide, please. So the other thing, I spent quite a bit of time on the value, but the reason I was doing that is, as you can see, 73% of respondents were struggling to validate their financial business benefits, and really what they were struggling with was articulating the value back to their original business case. And that primarily because they haven't done a great job of defining what value is and coming up with the ways of measuring it. So that's why we have those in the order they are. And I'd really encourage you, even if you have a program, to go back and re-challenge yourself on is it well defined, and is it doing what it's supposed to be doing. The next point is, as you can see, 80% of leaders, or just over 80% of leaders, are using joint business plan. What I've seen here, and this is really cool, is that this 80% of us are using the relationship to manage supply chain disruption, yet only 9% of us are any good at it. So pretty key point there. And final slide from me, just before Nick kicks me off, is just some things to think about in terms of highlights. Labour shortages have been a huge disruption in terms of resilience. So actually managing that within your supply chain or looking at how your suppliers are managing it is pretty key. So I won't run through each of those. There's some quite cool stats there. And you'll also get to read around Pressio, who was the case study there. So as I said, just standing back, anticipating what's going to challenge you and looking at your program, realigning that value and uplifting your resourcing. So as I said, 70% of organizations are challenged there. I'd like to thank you very much. There is a huge amount of stats. I've not done it justice, but hopefully I've encouraged you to open the book and go through and learn and talk to us. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and Alan, and as Alan said, rest assured the report is far better than Alan's presentation. So you must get into that. There's a theme of me beating up my boss. So now we're going to welcome Richard. It's great that we've had a CPO that has gone into the business. Now we have a CPO that has now gone into being a vendor, so knows all the tricks of the trade. Richard was global head of supply chain for Goldman Sachs, and now is running KY3 S&P Global in the region. So fascinating to get his insight, because yes, having these relationships and having the getting together and doing joint business planning is critical. Increasingly, if you haven't got the data, then you haven't got the information at your fingertips. So thank you, Richard, for joining us, and looking forward to your presentation.
No, great. Thank you, Nick. Can you hear me okay? Just want to check. Excellent. All right. And it's pretty depressing when I look at how young I was when I first started my new role at KY3P as part of S&P. So just shows you the 3 years that I have had. So just quickly introduce myself. So Richard Blore, Chairman and CEO of KY3P, and KY3P is part of the family of solutions and businesses that live within S&P Global. It's always such a privilege to speak to fellow procurement, third-party risk and supply chain professionals, and especially at a time when there is so much turbulence going on in the market, in the world, in the environment, that has really thrust procurement supply chain to the front of organizational leadership, strategy, and competitive advantage. So it's a very fascinating, interesting time to be in this profession. So I'm going to talk about resilience, but in particular, how managing supply chain resilience is transforming with the increasing level of technology and data that is available to the profession. But before I do, I just want to say thank you to Alan. I've been involved as a host of these sessions before, and I'm an avid reader of the report when it comes out. And please, if you have not done so, I cannot recommend highly enough the report and the insights that come out of this, the landmark survey that happens every year, and it's certainly highlighted by it. So Alan, thank you to you and State of Flux for continuing to drive and be the voice of supply relationship management for us as a profession. So Nick covered a little bit, just very quickly on my background. So about 25 years experience across multiple industries, most of it in procurement, supply chain. So I spent time in aerospace, construction, manufacturing, FMCG, and then prior to joining and leading the KY3P business, I was in financial services. So I've seen the whole sort of most of the arc of what supply chain procurement looks like. And critically, what I have learned through that time is things do go wrong, and they go wrong globally, they go wrong within your supply chain, they go wrong within a supplier, and they go wrong within a particular process. So it's really how we equip ourselves as a profession to detect that, react to it, predict it. But underpinning all of that, you can get all of that right. But if you don't have the right relationships with your suppliers, so back to Alan's key point, you have to build those relationships and manage those effectively. You're not going to be able to get the full benefits of having a resilient supply chain. very quickly on KY3P, it would be remiss as the head of the business not to do a little bit of a plug before we get into the meat of the topic. So KY3P was established about 6 years ago. It is owned and designed by procurement and supply chain professionals. So Alan, to your point, technology is a fundamental and emerging tool and capability for procurement and supply chain. But the KY3P business is really run, and my board is made up of procurement and third-party risk experts, and our design committee as well. So all of our solutions, our data, and our assessments capabilities, our managed service capabilities, we do the full end-to-end. They've all been designed with the input from and used by and for procurement professionals. So we hope that with that, we are absolutely relevant and hitting the mark in terms of delivering value across our growing global client base. Okay, on to resilience. So what is resilience and why is it important? I'm sure there are a bunch of textbook definitions of resilience. I could have gone to Wikipedia, all that stuff, but I just wanted to define it how I think about it. There's really 3 dimensions. It has to be 3 things, right? But there are 3 dimensions to resilience. So the first for me is time. So how resilient is your supply chain? How able is it to withstand both a short-term acute shock, but also increasingly we need to think about how resilient is the supply chain to be able to cope with longer-term systemic changes within a particular environment. So timing, number 1. Number 2 is breadth. So can your supply chain withstand an impact, an event, an attack across multiple risk domains? When I started out in this world, it was really financial health was pretty much the key indicator. But now we have to think about financial health, location risk, negative media, social media, sentiment, ESG, diversity, a whole bunch of different domains of risk that will change over time, and your supply chain needs to be resilient across all of those domains. And then the final one is squishiness or flex. So how adaptable, how reactive can your supply chain be when these things happen? Right? A perfectly designed but brittle and stagnant supply chain is as vulnerable to a supply chain that has no thought or design in it. Right? So you've got to have some flex and some ability to withstand those shocks. I think if we think about how data is now started to help organizations build resilient supply chains, a real example recently we all went through, it was COVID. And it was fascinating to work with a number of our clients and prospective clients and organizations and see how they were able to react. And in some cases, a number of them were able to drive real competitive advantage through their resilience of their supply chains. And really, the organizations fell into two buckets. There were those who were leading, so and they probably fit in your 9% group. So there were those that were leading, and they already had a technology solution in place that brought in the right data signals. So for COVID, financial health really was the key data signal, and how that flexed and how that moved. But importantly, understood who was critical to their business, who was critical within their supply chain, and had the monitoring capability. They got off the starting gate almost instantly. They reached out, they had those relationships with those suppliers, and they secured that supply. In some cases, organizations actually invested in those businesses to shore them up. In some cases, they acquired them, brought them in-house, but they had a plan and they did it quick. There was then a whole bunch of kind of middle to lagging runners where their first response was, yikes, where's my spreadsheet? So when they opened the spreadsheet, started to try and figure out who critical suppliers were, they realized that their contacts at those suppliers were out of date, so they then had to go back to the business and figure all of it out. And by the time of the next 3 to 6 months, by the time they started to get themselves in a position to manage their supply chains, the leading group were already off, they'd secured supply, and it was a real competitive advantage. So that for me was a real life stark example of when you get the data right, you have the right data signals in place, and you have the technology that lets you use it, you will deliver a competitive advantage and you will outperform. So what are some of the challenges that we see in how people think about resilience? So there's 3 or 4. One of them is really around complexity, which drives a lack of transparency. So you have a big complex supply chain, maybe you need it, but that will bring a challenge around transparency. So we have to solve for that. Assumed resilience is a big one. Just because you are a big organization with thousands of suppliers, that is not the same thing as resilience. You know, we all hear about the too big to fail. Well, we know how that ends. Right? I think you cannot assume you have resilience because you have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of suppliers. And in fact, that actually hides where your real resilience issues are and your Achilles heel. And then one that is, you know, an increasing risk, I think, is lack of integration. And by that, I mean, you have a procurement organization off doing one thing, maybe optimizing for spend. You have a third-party risk organization that are off optimizing for risk, and you have supply chain that are optimizing for delivery. Right? I think if you're not careful, those three things can even be in conflict. So you've got to be able to drive alignment across those three areas. I think the final bit for me is, you know, how we think about resilience in terms of how it changes. So you have to be absolutely, you know, relentless in terms of maintaining your view and your perspective on your supply chain. In a weird way, supply chains do age. So you will build a supply chain to cope with a particular set of circumstances, and over time, as the world changes, the resilience erodes. So you've got to be relentless. It has to be built in. As one of the earlier speakers says, it's got to be built into everything you do every day, to the point where I don't even think you should be talking about resilience. I think it should just be ingrained across your business and just embedded in everything. All right, so the next generation of technology and data, how are people using that, and how are we seeing that deployed across the industry? And I'm sure, like many of you, I grew up in procurement in a time when there was really an information and a transparency and a data drought, right? You know, category managers maybe Googled stuff. You may have had a D&B report, which was back then pretty basic. But you did it based on gut feel. You did a bit of a category strategy and went for it. Then spreadsheets, fantastic. We actually had a way of structuring our data, but you know, a lot of the information in there was qualitative, not quantitative. So how reliable was it? You fast forward to today, organizations are overwhelmed. That is the risk that we have. They're overwhelmed with the amount of information that they can get. And they're not able, using a spreadsheet or the old processes or SharePoint, whatever, they're not able to scale and manage that resilience on a large industrial scale. So how do you optimize it? How do you make sure that you're bringing the data and you're converging it with technology and making it work for you as an organization? So first things first, you have to identify the signals and the data that you want to get. So are you looking predominantly around financial health? Are you looking for location risk? Are you looking for cyber? You know, what are you looking for? And I think the answer is you probably want to look at everything. So you've got to figure out what data is coming in. An absolute must-have is a technology platform that will converge it all into a single view of your suppliers and help you to automate. There is a level of validation and testing you need. So the data will get you so far, and it will be foundational and fundamental, but you need to have a way of, either through an assessment of some sort, an examination, an on-site, some way of validating the data that you get, so you can have assurance that your view and the indicators you have are effective, especially for your critical and most critical suppliers. And the final bit is people and talent. There is a talent drought for sure going on at the moment. So you've got to really be focused on bringing the right talent, training the right talent, retaining the right talent, who can then really use the technology and the tools that you're providing to them to drive that resilience. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a bit of a deeper dive into some of those key elements. So let's start with the data. The data that is available from both public and private sources is just increasing exponentially. Every day there is something new. There is a new organization come out, they can give you a new insight, and it can really come together to give you that full 360. One example of that, which I think is very interesting, is around climate change. So ESG data is continuing to emerge and get better and better and better. But just think about an example where you have a manufacturing supply chain. Your third, fourth tier supplier has a production facility in Florida or Alabama. we can, and organizations can now give you very good climate models that will tell you how susceptible is that production facility over the next 10 years to flooding. And so maybe you don't want a production facility that's very susceptible to flooding. And that's what I mean. The data allows you to start to think about supply chain resilience over those dimensions, and in particular around that time dimension. So getting the right data, thinking about it the right way, really using it in the right way is critical. I talked about the validation of suppliers. Again, I think use the data to tell you where you want to dive deeper, and then make sure you have the right capabilities for the assessments, whether it's an on-site, whether it's a remote, to go in and really pull the covers up around an organization, and in particular, their control effectiveness, their backup plans, their BCPs, and their general resilience approach. I think that is absolutely critical. Will never be replaced purely with data. There will always be a role for that kind of actual validation. And where it all comes together, where it all becomes powerful, is in the platform, the technology that brings all of those different elements together. So we are now at a point where we can pretty much automate the onboarding and the monitoring process. As long as we have the right data signals in place, and we have our work with our clients to define the right risk appetites, we can pretty much show you almost instantly for a single supplier or a portfolio of suppliers where they stand, how they match against your risk appetites, and are they going to make you more resilient or less resilient, and then monitor that. How's that going to change over time? And what that really does, connecting into the final point around talent, strips away so much of the administrative burden and the turning the handle on the machine, that it lets you take your precious constrained resource, your procurement supply chain professionals, and point them at managing the commercial, managing the business outcomes, and managing the risk that you really, really want them focused on. So for me, I'll summarize now before I hand back to Nick. But we're certainly in a new age. There is more data than we know what to do with. So you've got to have the technology in place to capture it and to utilize it. Resilience is a clear competitive advantage, right? But don't assume you've got it. You have to work at it day by day by day. It's like a garden. You've got to be on it all the time. You've got to be pruning it. You've got to be improving it. You've got to monitoring it. Having the right suppliers in place is the foundation. For resilience, to invest in those relationships, which is what today is all about, and then embrace the data. So that's it. Nick, over to you, and I think I'll be back for the panel later. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. And I think the other thing it may come up in the questions, but another thing that when I speak to certainly European clients is they're feeling the reality that there's going to be increased requirement to have that transparency as well, often driven by a sustainability standard or other. So, as well as driving resilience, it's just going to be a core requirement to have better transparency, whether that's on an ongoing basis or when suppliers join the company. So, yeah, it's definitely going that direction, and it's the combination of both which we see. Right, change of direction now. So if like me, you like watching SAS celebrities, and you like watching celebrities run down cliffs and freezing water, and even simulating drowning was one I watched last night. We got the real thing in Dan White, a Formula elite soldier. We thought it'd be nice to mix it up. So Alan's going to chat to Dan and hopefully get some insight into how he views the different viewpoint. Thanks very much, Alan. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
Hi, Alan.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. I'm interested if that's the view everyone's got of the SAS. But the first thing I'll tell you is that none of that happens in the regiment, and the reason that you don't see what happens on the telly is that it doesn't make very good TV when you walk up to a tent in the middle of the night, unzip it, the instructor gives you a grid reference, and then you walk onto another tent about 10 kilometers away, and that goes on for a month. So that doesn't make great TV. Anyway,
hopefully it makes great resilience then. So.
Well, it does. It builds a certain amount of physical resilience, that's for sure, but not great TV. So that'll make all the rest of it up. I've got a surprise for you, Alan.
Great. Just what I need.
So the first thing is, one of the things we get told in the military is no plan survives contact with the enemy. So that should be a lesson to all you supply chain people. So in this case, I'm not going to be talking about the paras and the SAS, because about half an hour ago, my mate JMO walked into my house, and JMO and I were on an Everest expedition in 2000 with the military, with the SAS actually. So it's a good opportunity to talk about that, because quite a few bits of resilience were needed on that trip. So your job, you can stand down, but I want you to impersonate the Kiwi guide Russell Bryce a couple of times during the next 10 minutes, because I can't do a Kiwi accent. So stand by for that.
Okay. Well, we'll practice what we preach and be agile and resilient now, Dan. So
yes, think on your feet, mate. Never criticise the man on the ground.
Exactly.
Right. First of all, can I introduce Mark James, who's another SAS soldier who was on the Everest expedition with me.
Good morning, everybody. Known as JMO since I joined the army at the age of 16, a long time ago.
Yeah. So as you probably picked up, JMO's from Wales, which he's allegedly from Wales, but I know that he was born in Broadmoor, which literally Broadmoor, the asylum, which is on his birth certificate, which will explain a lot, which I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes. He claims his father was one of the warders, but anyone who's seen one throw over the cuckoo's nest knows there's not much difference between the warders and the inmates.
So Dan, how did, because both you and JMO clearly were in the SAS, and you're going to talk to us about your Everest summits. How did that?
You just ruined it, mate. I was still talking about the expedition. You've now told us that we were successful.
Oh, sorry. Well,
mate,
yeah. I think we've kind of given that away. But yes, you were successful.
Of course we were successful. Otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it anyway. Well, basically what happened was the regiment's got a long history of allowing its members to do extreme endurance events, and in the 80s, I think, 2 guys climbed Everest from the south side, but the military expedition had never climbed Everest from the north side, which is the Mallory and Irvine side. So someone in the regiment came up with this idea, and JMO and I, as transpired, were 2 of the strongest climbers in the regiment, and we got on this trip. But neither of us had climbed above 6,000 meters ever, which isn't great preparation for an Everest attempt, as became quite obvious as when we got there. But nonetheless, when we got there, we realised that we were fairly unprepared in normal terms. So what most people would think about Everest now, that it's pretty much doable by anyone on a pogo stick if they've got enough money, because everyone, there's huge queues, 300 people on the Hillary step trying to climb the mountain, all supported by hundreds of Sherpas, which is true. But when we did it, we were on the other side of the mountain and we had very little support. We had to carry everything ourselves, and we also had to take all our provisions up. We didn't go on oxygen until 8,500 meters. Nowadays, people are going on oxygen at 7,000 meters and below. So that is a huge difference. JMO and I went up to the North Col of Everest, which is 7,000 meters, 10 times as to acclimatise and to carry all our stuff up. that meant, because what we'll talk about later on, that we are able to survive, where if people who are now going on oxygen at 7,000 meters, they would not have survived what we went through. So you can call that resilience, you can call it supply chain management, planning, whatever you want, but we didn't leave anything to chance in our preparation. So what I'll do is I'll skip forward to base camp in Tibet in 2000, about 3 or 4 days before we ended up summiting. The Kiwi guide, Hugh Allen, called Russell Bryce, was running a big commercial expedition. He's quite well known. He's been in a number of films. He's a really good bloke, unlike Hugh Allen. But he has the same kind of what I want to try and do. Can you mix in sarcasm and irony into your voice, because you don't get a lot of plaudits from Kiwis. So he came into our tent and said, guys, why aren't you going for the summit? Go on, Alan. In a Kiwi accent.
Yeah. It'll be fine, Dan, isn't it? That's your catchphrase.
Yeah. You need to get a little bit of contempt into it as well, if you can. But anyway, he said to us, why weren't we going for the summit? And we looked up and no one else is going for the summit. And he said, yeah, but I've got clients with me and it's not really safe enough because there's no fixed line on the top of the mountain. So I can't take my clients, but if you're climbers, you should be going for it. So Jamo and I looked at each other, and Jamo did tell me quite recently that it was quite a nervy moment. And I was thinking, I also had quite a nervy moment when you have to make the call to do something which might not end well. But we just got up and said, right, well, we better get going then. And much to the surprise of the rest of our team, we said, well, we're off to the summit. We're going up to Advanced Base Camp now. And off we went with our single Sherpa, Nartemba. Now, Nartemba had been to the summit 7 times, so his nickname was 7 Up. And he was a very, very strong guy, but not the best communicator. Anyway, we went to Advanced Base Camp. We had a night there, and the weather looked all right. So we pushed up to the North Col at 7,000 meters, but we went straight past the North Col because we were extremely well acclimatized. And then we got to our next camp, which was at about 7,800 meters. Not before I'd set fire to the tent at 7,000 meters. So, it's not all glory. I have to admit that, like making a brew, I'd set fire to the tent, much to Jamo's amusement, but managed to put it out. So our backup plan of, being able to hide in the tent in the event of a storm wasn't looking quite so cozy. So that night, spent a reasonable night at 7,800 meters on that's the North Ridge of Everest. Wasn't too bad, but in the morning, faced with moving up to 8,400 meters, carrying probably we had 2 oxygen bottles each, the tent, sleeping bag each, gas, stove, food, water, extra warm clothes, medical kit. So we were carrying at least 40 pounds at 7,800 to 8,400 meters. So no client on any expedition does that for very good reason, because it couldn't. So because we were special forces soldiers and we'd had a lot of experience of carrying heavy shit, it wasn't really that hard for us, we knew, we'd been there before. But facing that prospect, which you never see in any of the films, I was like, well, I better take a dump, because I don't want to have to take a dump halfway up the mountain. So I'm sorry to lower the tone, and I know you never see this in any film, but you know, this is a fact of life. But so I stepped out of the tent and made a bit of a miscalculation, because to cover the 10 meters to my chosen spot takes quite a long time at that altitude. And I hadn't quite realized how cold it was and how long the whole process would take me. So by the time I'd completed it, my hands are completely frozen and were also not the cleanest. So I staggered back to the tent, and I wasn't that worried, because I knew that in time-honoured alpine mountaineering tradition, I will be able to shove my hands into JMO's armpits to alleviate the frostbite that was no doubt coming. Unfortunately,
Dan got frostbite.
Yeah, so JMO wasn't too keen on having the hands in his armpits, which I can't really blame him, but he did pass me some toilet paper that he'd kind of casually dipped into the tea he'd been making, but it didn't really have the same effect. Anyway, I didn't actually realise, luckily, that I got frostbite at that point, and we set off to climb up to the North Collar, 8,400 meters. Now, as I said, we were carrying 40 pounds. We were not using oxygen. So it's difficult to describe how physically hard that is, but trust me, it's right at the edge of what you can do. So we got to, me and Nartemba got to 884, and we had to cut out a tent platform and put our tent up, which we did. Just finished that, and JMO arrived, casually strolling along, much to my disgust. But I have to admit that my efforts at cutting a tent platform were like trying to break through a concrete wall with a toffee hammer. It was absolutely pathetic, and Nartemba did most of it. But we got in the tent and got, you know, prepared for what's meant to be the worst night on earth, camping at 8,400 meters. But JMO, we've been in Sennybridge, haven't we? So yeah,
We certainly have.
yeah. So when you've been in the military and you spend a lot of time in trenches in Wales, you know, it being in a tent and sleeping bag isn't really that bad, although you are coughing a lot. We got up at 1 o'clock and set off for the summit. At this point, we put our oxygen on, and the difference it made was just unbelievable, even though we were only on quite a low flow rate, because we only had 2 bottles and we were like the only people on the mountain, not like you see nowadays on the Nepalese side. So we set off, and you tend to go at your own pace there, because it's just so hard. You set a rhythm and you just keep going. What people don't say is that when you're above 8,000 meters, you're hypoxic even with oxygen. So your oxygen saturation is probably in the 80s, which if you turned up in a hospital in the UK with an oxygen saturation of mid 80s, you'd be put on oxygen and probably in intensive care. But because you're acclimatized, you know, we could stand it, but you're drunk basically. So you make poor decisions and you're wandering around a bit lightheaded. But luckily, me and Jem had done a lot of that, so it wasn't new to us. So the main obstacles on the North Ridge are the first, second, and third step. At the bottom of the third step, you turn your oxygen up because it's very, very hard climbing. And we got over that and we regrouped together and turned our oxygen down to 2 litres a minute and carried on. I remember looking at the summit thinking for the first time, we're actually definitely going to make this, and we should be up there in about 20 minutes. But 2 hours later, we were still walking up, and I completely lost track of time. But I had no idea. I just was carrying on. Eventually, the 3 of us got to the summit, sat down for a bit and did a bit of filming, or JMO did the filming. He did all the filming, to be fair to him. And sat back down again after about 20 minutes. And it's quite something to feel at that moment that we were the 3 highest guys in the world on the planet for a moment. And we sat back down. But I know in my mind, I was just concentrating on surviving, because I knew that the majority of fatalities are on the way down, not on the way up, because you're more tired, you're not concentrating, and the climbing is more dangerous coming down than going up. And I sat down at...
just a quick one, Dan.
I sat down, yeah.
Didn't your guide, you had a challenge with your guide, didn't you? And your...
Yeah, I'll come to that, mate. So he, on the way down, it was about 50 meters below the summit, and JMO and Nartemba are ahead of me. So I was the last guy on the mountain, and I remember sitting down, which they tell you never to do, because you can't get, sometimes you just don't get up. But I sat down next to a point where I needed to change the carabiner over to another line, and I remember to this day thinking, I'm lucky that I've done so much hard stuff, because I wouldn't want to have to find out how tough I am right now, because it's not the time for that, you know. So I knew that I wasn't going to give up, and I knew that I had the resilience, if you like, to keep going. So we pressed on down the ridge, and we were moving very, very slowly. And JMO came up to me and he said, "Go on, JMO, what happened?"
I think you carry on.
Yeah. Well, so JMO had run out of oxygen at this point, because he'd forgotten to turn his oxygen down. Not that I'm not bitter about it, but he'd forgotten to turn his oxygen down to 2. So as a result of that, he had no oxygen. So now we're on the ridge of Everest at probably 8,600 meters. JMO's on no oxygen, haven't got any spare oxygen, and we're moving very, very slowly. And I said to JMO, "You press ahead, because I'll stay with a Sherpa who is moving slower than we were," which was quite surprising. But he couldn't communicate with us very well. So JMO moved off, and I could see him ahead, and I could see our tents down this rope, but our Sherpa was not moving quick. So I moved up to him, and I was like, "Yeah, Nartemba, I pointed to the tents, and he looked at me, and I realized that he was going snowblind and that he couldn't see the tents. So we're now on 8.5 maybe on Everest, with a snowblind Sherpa and one guy without oxygen. So this is why you need to be resilient." We got down to the tent, me and Nartemba, quite easily actually, because he wasn't fully blind at this point. And JMO had got there, and the kind of oxygen hypoxic drunkenness had taken over. So our crampons came off. We got a brew on. We got on the radio instead of going down to the next camp straight away, which would have been the decision anyone else would have made. But of course, being a bit pissed, we thought we'd stay another night. So Nartemba just stood up and said, "Advanced base camp," and walked off. So this guy was a bit of a legend, he was now 8 up. He just walked off down the line. So it transpired, of course, that he knew he was going to go blind, and he wanted to get as low as possible, and he thought he could get to advanced base camp, but we knew there was no way we were strong enough to get to advanced base camp. So it would have taken us half an hour to get our crampons back on. So he just went off, and we couldn't. That was it. He was gone. So we stayed the night at 8.4 in the tent. It wasn't the best night, because we've now spent 2 nights in the death zone on minimal oxygen, which is not great. In the morning, we got up very early, hadn't really slept at all, and set off down to our camp at 7, 8. So we get to the camp. I remember it was 7 in the morning, and it was a beautiful day. And JMO said, "Should we have a brew? Because we're not coming back here again." And I was like, my natural inclination was to press on, but I was like, no, he's right. Well, you know, we've got plenty of time, and we've done this bit of the route many times. So we'll have a cup of tea in British Army fashion. So he unzips the tent, and JMO's like, "Oh, look, Dan, look who's in here." It was Nar Temba. So he'd managed to get down 500 meters or 600 meters to the next camp, but he was asleep in the tent, and he was completely blind. His eyes were shut like a boxer's. So we got on the radio to our team and asked them to come up to support us, bring the guy down. But unfortunately, they weren't where they were meant to be, because no plan survives contact with the enemy, and we're on our own. So that's another story.
Yeah, Dan, conscious of time, and that's been unbelievably fascinating. I think the key takeaway for us here is, as you said, no plan survives contact with the enemy, or frankly contact with, in our industry, with suppliers. And then the other takeaway is make sure you arm yourself with plenty cups of tea, I think, or brew, because that seems to have got you both up and down from Everest.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to, I'm just conscious of time. Dan, hugely appreciated. I know you've got a wealth of other stories that I'm sure all of us want to hear at some point, but we're going to have to hand it back to Nick. And yeah, thanks, Dan. I know I owe you a beer for this, and I'll look forward to
many beers.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dan.
Right, thanks, guys. Good luck.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think I'd like to join that beer to hear some of those stories. I'm sure there's quite a few. I'm sure there's a film in there somewhere with some of that commentary. So, right. So now we're going on to the panel, and just while they're getting themselves organised, oh, David's already organised. So I'll introduce him. So let me introduce David. David's is the only person you've not met other than John. John Newton's going to be our moderator. He's from Steady Flux. David's CPO of Thames Water. And I was thinking about, you know, it was a drought in the summer, so everything was yellow and barren. And at the weekend, I was driving through a flood, and I was thinking, you know, this guy's job is actually to react to the elements. I think, you know, at a time of climate change, you know, Simon's job is to react to, you know, almost like the global scene, and that's becoming more and more volatile. And David has to react to the climate. So I think, you know, in the two of them, we've got great examples of people that really have chosen to go for challenges, and be fantastic to hear from them, and also to hear some of your questions. So looking forward to it. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Nick, and again, thanks to everyone in the panel for joining us. I can say that at this time we've got some really interesting questions that we've had submitted from the audience, so we'll certainly get those into this segment. But just leading up to that, just to get our discussion with the panel going, I'd like to anchor my first point to a line that was on one of Alan's slides. I read where it said, "Resilience is the ability to protect what you can, harnessed with the ability to manage what you can't." And I want to connect that with a conversation I had with David Wiley less than a week ago, actually, about also needing to be able to anticipate and be prepared. We were talking about energy and resilience, David, if you remember. Would you mind sharing some of your thoughts with us on that, please?
Yeah, thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. Yes, so like a lot of organisations that will be on the call, Thames Water is a huge energy consumer. So, you know, we're providing about 2.5 billion litres of water a day. We're clearing up waste for sort of 14 million customers, and that consumes a huge amount of energy. And over the last
couple of months, we've certainly seen, like many others, a massive increase in our energy costs. And I think we're thinking about that in a couple of ways. Firstly, I think we're thinking about how do we build more resilience in our network from a sort of energy generation point of view. So we already have a pretty significant percentage of our energy is renewable energy, but we think we've got the opportunity to drive that further, and that's partly through how do we develop our sites into more solar capacity. So we own quite a lot of land, as you might imagine. So how do we utilize that from the solar? How do we think about how we use waste products? So, again, without going into the details, there's a huge amount of energy in the waste that we get through the system, and we can turn that into either energy that we use to fire power stations, or biomethane gas, which again we can use to burn as gas in the system. So our first thing of sort of, how do we deal with what we've got? Partly our journey is about building resilience through using the products and the facilities that we've got to generate more of our own. But I think on the supplier theme as well, we're also thinking about how do we restructure some of the commercial deals that we have, and how do we start to have conversations with suppliers, and how do we start to build commercial deals that incentivize them to help us cut our energy consumption. And a good example of that is in the pump space. So, again, we buy a lot of pumps to pump water and to pump waste products around the network. And the biggest cost of running a pump is actually the energy cost. It's not the cost of the pump in itself. And, we're starting to think about how do we commercialize deals with our pump manufacturers that incentivize them to have demonstrable kind of reductions in energy cost. And, I think we can only do that through sort of proactive, collaborative conversations with suppliers. Otherwise, we're still stuck in their mindset of paying a price for a pump, or maybe trying to pay a cheaper price for a pump, and that's really not going to drive the organisation where we need to go.
Perfect, thanks. That is that prevent what you can, harness what you can't manage, but also look and plan for the future as much as you can. Bit of crystal ball reading, I guess, there. Just a quick point, if anyone's thinking, how do I submit a question? Just find the questions panel, or use chat in the GoTo webinar interface, and we'll see it here in the studio. Picking up on that point about anticipating and being prepared, Simon Cox, we heard you talking about being prepared for the unrehearsed in your presentation, shifting the approach from specific scenarios to being ready for the unexpected, so to speak. Linking it to David's point about the need to anticipate and be prepared, how do you think your approach to pilot training can actually be borrowed, transposed, I would say, in all sorts of procurement and supply chain situations, so that both we and our suppliers are able to work like you train your pilots to be ready for what we don't know is coming?
Great question. I think what I would say is that the role that kind of game playing situations plays in kind of managing uncertainty. So maybe an example from our business, we revamped the way that we approach crisis management, and we very quickly realized that we've been preparing for a certain type of crisis that involves aircraft. Actually, the most likely is IT failure, data leaks, etc. So you involve people from a wider audience, and actually you role play that to create some kind of muscle memory. I think in terms of procurement and supply chain stuff, just picking up on where David's point about energy, for us, we're involved in a business that has no viable alternative. Solar powered engines are a long way off. So creating some certainty in what we can control, for sure, is part and parcel of that, creating certainty in hedging, etc. But really the lessons from both of these examples is you have to involve the overall business. We're a business that sells tickets in advance. Depending on the nature of your business, you will take certain steps to mitigate whatever threats you see on the horizon. So where you have alternatives, you will take one set of approaches. Where you don't, you may trade off for certainty in price. So I think that's probably the lesson I would give to everybody. Think about the business model in which you operate. What are the key factors that determine then your approach, and then involve as many actors in the business in that approach and gameplay it until it becomes kind of muscle memory and everybody instinctively knows what the way forward is. Interesting that Alan identify the source of value and where that is, and then let that follow through for the whole business.
Perfect. That protect the value kind of line of inquiry is really powerful. Thanks, Simon. Richard, I'd like to bring you on this one, if I may, just before we move on to some of the audience questions that we've got building up like crazy at the moment. I'm thinking back to when you and I were talking not too long ago now, and you really made me stop and think when you said concentration risk is the resilience killer. I'm sure everyone would love to hear your views on that, because it's obviously something that's very, very pertinent to how supply chains have evolved to actually concentrate sourcing on certain proven, quotes, safe suppliers. But tell me a bit more about why concentration risk is the resilience killer.
Yeah, hey, thanks, John. Simon, just very quickly, I thought your answer was great for the previous question. The one thing I'd add is make sure when you learn the lessons, implement the lessons learned. Because I'm sure we've all seen examples where we've done drills, we've done scenario testing. Someone in the room has gone, oh, it'd be brilliant if we had that piece of information. And we go, yeah, that'd be a good idea. And then it actually happens and you didn't do it. So you've got to quickly follow through on the lessons learned. Yeah, concentration risk. So I talked a little bit about in my session where one of the biggest corrosive factors for resilience is you assume because you have got a diversified tier one supply base with multiple suppliers, you have a resilient supply chain. I think what we're all starting to understand, and in particular with a financial services lens on, the regulators are super focused on concentration risk. What they're thinking about is, okay, so you have tier one suppliers, very diversified, fantastic, but what happens in the second, third, fourth layer? And especially where certain suppliers, for example, the cloud providers, certain market infrastructures, there's certain critical pieces of technology. I'm thinking things like payment capability for lots of retail organizations. Many of them rely on 2 or 3 industry-leading pieces of technology or capability that are often buried 4th level supply, 5th level supply. And I think rightly so, people need to be cognizant of and avoid there being an unknown critical dependency buried somewhere in your supply chain. So all of a sudden, I'm exaggerating, but 80% of organizations reliant on AWS without knowing it. Right? And if something happens to AWS, what does everybody do? And so that's one key element of concentration risk. And I think this is where procurement have to work hand in hand with third-party risk and supply chain in the business to make sure that when selection is made, and contracting in particular, contracting is a powerful tool, you're able to have the ability to drill down to identify those critical suppliers and that concentration risk. So that's one element of concentration risk for sure. There are others. Location. Is your data overly concentrated with 3 or 4 suppliers, so they are super vulnerable to a particular type of cyber attack? But yeah, just have a think about that concentration and where it is hidden within the multi-layers of your supply chain.
Perfect, thanks, Richard. And as I was listening to you kind of telling me that, it reminded me of something David Wiley was telling me not that long ago about how you were competing for oxygen during COVID. You kind of think about almost like where's the supply concentrated and how much of it can we get, and the issue on needing to work on relationships as the response to being in that situation. Just briefly, could you kind of give us some of your key takeaways of what was happening when you were competing for oxygen and how you got through it?
Yeah, so this is during COVID, and as people would have seen, the NHS suddenly has a huge demand for oxygen, for ventilators to manage the upswing in COVID patients. And oxygen is a key part of our production approach as we oxygenate the water. And it wasn't really competing with the NHS, because the issue wasn't really around supply availability, but it was really about how do we manage the delivery consumption that the NHS needed in this vast array of hospitals versus the deliveries we needed to keep the water supply running. And what that led to was a number of conversations really about how do we structure in both timings to NHS hospital deliveries and timings to our own sites to ensure that we can manage both elements. And again, that took a lot of conversations and a lot of planning with our supply chain to make sure that we, as anyone else, we didn't want to make sure that the NHS couldn't get supply either. So it was really about how we could manage supply across the two elements. So for us, it was making sure that we could be far more flexible in our approach, think about what sort of volumes we really needed, make sure there was enough volume in the system for the NHS to use as well. And ultimately, in conversations with our suppliers, we prioritised deliveries to hospitals over our own sites, and just made sure that we could work out of hours to deal with that.
Interesting, thanks. And by the way, there's a really interesting article in our research report this year where we did an interview with Air Products, which will also give some interesting background into that whole dynamic. I'm going to turn to some audience questions now, and I've got one which I'd like to put to Alan, if I may, and it kind of links to this aspect here of customer of choice, really. So this question has been submitted by Kendall Smith. Kendall, thank you very much. And Alan, Kendall's question is, how do you actually measure where you are on the customer of choice scale?
Hey, Kendall, good to hear from you. Yeah, thank you for that question, because that tees me up nicely. I'll try not to do a big sales pitch for this one, but the way we approach it is, firstly, we want to understand what's important to the suppliers. So we give them a series of criteria around how they do business with you. So some of those basic pieces of criteria might be, payment, all the way through to how do they navigate you for innovation. And we ask the supplier to rank those criteria in order of importance to them. We then ask them to score you against those areas of importance. And then the nugget is they then score your competitors or their best customer. Because in some cases, your competitor for a certain product, in David's case, for oxygen, the competitor isn't other utilities, it was the NHS, or perhaps not competitor, but I think you know where I'm going from for that. So that gives us that customer choice ranking. So we tend to recommend that it's done anonymously so that suppliers feel comfortable giving you responses about your competitors. Otherwise, most people will not give you that information. And we also, the way we do it is we'll survey typically between 100 and 200 suppliers, and then we'll interview roughly 10% of them. And the reason for doing that is that gives us enough coverage across your supplier base to make it statistically valid. And the interviews give us the anecdotal evidence that you will need to position supply management within your organization. The key part for running that customer of choice measure is threefold. One is to focus your energy into the places that give you the biggest impact, i.e. highest important, where you've scored poorly or behind your competitors. So it focuses your energy in the right place. The second one is it's brilliant for giving you that internal case for change, because it's not you saying you need to improve, it's coming directly from your suppliers. And then the third reason is this is the way of benchmarking whether your supply management program is a success. Clearly over time, because you don't run it as a one and done, you'd run it we recommend every 18 months to 2 years. Over time you should be improving as a customer of choice. I'll just give you one quick final point on it. not to be confused with what we call a 360 review, which is more of a one-to-one for a specific supplier. And that we look at customer, trust and control attributes around the relationship. So customer of choices are across all your suppliers. How do you be a more attractive customer? Whereas a 360 is far more focused on that particular relationship and what needs to be addressed in that relationship. Both are important, both need to be run, but please don't confuse the two.
John, can I just sorry one?
Yeah, go for it, Richard.
I think there's a really interesting link that we see between resilience and customer of choice. So you can absolutely see in an organization's risk profile how responsive suppliers are to their due diligence requests, how willing suppliers are to invest to remediate control gaps and get themselves up to meet the risk appetite of an organization. An organization that is a customer of choice, their response times are quicker, their risk acceptance rates are lower for control issues, their breaches tend to be lower because they've got that relationship, those relationships, and people want to do business with them. An organization that is not a customer of choice takes longer to get information, the vendors are disengaged, and they're less willing to invest in their control standards to meet the risk appetite. So there's a definite connection we see between resilient supply chain and being a customer of choice.
Thanks, Richard. So Kendall, I hope you got the answer there. I'm pretty sure you did. Let's bring in another audience question. I'm going to ask the panel to be quite brief on this because we want to get as many in as we can. So the next one is a question which is, there seems to be a platform for everything at the moment. How do you bring it all together with tighter budgets? What should the priority be? And let me see. Let me take that question to Richard first, but I am going to ask you to be really brief, Richard.
I'll be super brief and I won't do a sales pitch. So yes, there are a number of what would claim to be best in breed for each section of the source to pay process. But my advice would be get a platform. Right? There's loads to choose from. You need to have a platform and pick one that is really optimized around either procurement or third-party risk. Trying to shoehorn an ERP system in or a GRC system in really is suboptimal. Second is if budgets are constrained, you can do a lot by taking data feeds and assessment information and plugging that into your existing infrastructure. So there are ways to step change your program without having a really costly platform implementation.
Perfect, thanks. And also thanks to someone called Robert Hode for that question. Thanks for submitting the question, Rob. All right, a quick question which I'm going to put around the panel actually. So if you're good, you'll just give me a yes or no to this. It's a question that Joe Andrews submitted. Joe's question is, do you think that the future commercial/procurement teams should be trained more in risk management? Does supply chain management sit within commercial? Need to be really brief on that one. I'll take that one to Simon and then I'll pass it to David and then we'll go around the table. But gents, please be brief. Simon, do we need more training?
I would say so, but I would say that training has to take place as a joint group. There is no procurement risk or business risk sat separately. They are intrinsic. There is only risk out there. How you deal with it and how you divide the actions to mitigate it, completely up to you, but it has to be a joint activity.
Perfect, thanks. David, what are your thoughts on that? Do we need more risk training?
Yeah, for me, absolutely critical part of the role. If we're setting ourselves up to be market experts, we live in a very changing world, so absolutely core part of the role for me in future.
Perfect, thank you. Richard?
Yes.
Do we need more risk training?
Did you hear me? I said yes. I was muting and not muting, but yeah.
It's taking me literally about being concise. Someone that won't do that, but they've got to, is Alan Day. Alan, do we need more risk training? He's not even talking to me now.
Of course, we need more risk training, and you can talk about your amazing risk course that you do in supply management and our supply management technology that Richard should have mentioned.
Okay, thanks. I'm not going to though, because I've got another audience question here, and this is the last one that we'll use, and then we'll transition into the wrap up. So the last question I'm going to take from the audience is one of how do we bring the leadership along with us in terms of making supplier relationship management and the value of supplier management happen? How do we bring the leadership along with us? I think I'm going to, if David doesn't mind, I'd like to ask you that one first, because I know that going into Thames Water, etc., you've had to go in as a fresh pair of eyes and sort of get that sort of thing to happen. So again, I'm going to ask you to be really brief. How do we bring the leadership along with us?
So I think for me, it's about, I mean, we tell a lot of stories at Thames, and I tell, you know, a lot of, I think storytelling is quite important in here. But for me, the business case has changed over the last couple of years. You know, we spent a long time in the supplier management world trying to talk to organisations about what it's going to save to put in supplier management. I think now the narrative is very much, you know, what could you lose if you don't have the right relationships in place? So for me, that's how we brought the leadership on board. It's about risk mitigation, it's about continuity of service, it's about improving our customer service. And we talk less about what's it financially going to save and more about how does this keep our business moving in the right direction.
Thank you. And maybe lastly, final word on this one in terms of convincing business leaders to support the change. I think he knows where it's going to go. Simon Cox.
Thanks, John. I would say start with a value and then recognise that CEOs largely don't come from a background where they get out of bed to save costs. So chase the value and articulate it in terms that they can get excited about. I think, you know, labelling it sublime, you know, value, etc. It just talk about value in general, excite the leadership team about what it adds to what the organisation is going to achieve, and they'll naturally come with you.
Thanks, Simon. Appreciate that. That's just about all the time we've got for questions today. But as Nick said, we've captured them all in the system, and we will get responses to you to all of them. So let me quickly invite Nick Heiner to come back and take us out of this segment, and then we'll go into our wrap up. Has anyone seen Nick Heiner? Oh, here he is.
Yeah, no, still here. I'm going to be incredibly brief because I know that we're almost at time, and Alan's got a couple of final slides to go through. So just a thank you from me. You know, obviously represent the European team at State of Flux. Thank you so much for, you know, to the speakers. I know Alan will do his own thank you. If any of you want to do a benchmark, want to do the research, then get in touch with us. We'd love to do that. And also please give us your feedback on the form, because we want to improve. We want to improve this and other events. We'll be running other events in the beginning of first quarter of next year. So thanks everyone for supporting. Fantastic attendance. Thank you, and I'll leave it to Alan to close.
Thanks, Nick. And the feedback here is that Mr. Simon Cox and I are actually in the same room, despite hopefully looking like we're not, but apologies there. But a huge thank you to all you attendees today. And if we do have questions that we haven't managed to get to, we will come back to you with answers to those questions. So yeah, thank you for those. I think the key message here is, you know, if you've done an SRM program, now it's time to relook at it. If you haven't done one, look at it now. There's never been a better time for us to get in front of our executive teams and CEOs. As Simon kindly put it, we've got to position it in their language. It's got to be positioned as value and how they're going to add value. There was a recent Harvard, well, just prior to the pandemic, there was a Harvard article looking at CEOs' time, and only 1% of the CEO's time was spent on suppliers, which clearly is wrong. Now, we know over the pandemic that a lot more of that time was spent on suppliers. So the door is open. We've got to use that, and we've got to beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission on this one. We've mentioned technology. Technology has been discussed all the way through. Would love to show you what we're doing in technology around supply management, but there's clearly lots of platforms out there. My challenge to you is, as you could see from the technology results today, your P2P and ERP type systems aren't really fit for purpose at this point, but there's still plenty of, there's ours and other options around supplier management and focused on that. Training, there's some really exciting things happening in training. John looks after our training portfolio for us. We know that leaders train their people, and certainly we've been expanding what we're doing in terms of training. So there is some pretty cool training available. Please reach out and talk to us about it, and share the reports. There's a huge amount of information in there. It's free. If you need hard copies, we're happy to post those to you, because we're sorry we're not in front of you. But we also have a cool online version that makes noises when you turn the page. So yeah, make sure you get the book and share it with your team, and just let's keep talking. This is a key topic. We as an industry need to be better at it. So let's keep the communication up. We're happy to share stats and data to help you with your internal business cases at any point in time. So that's it for me. A huge thank you to everyone. I know we've had an amazing audience and participation today. So much appreciated, and I'll look forward to catching up with hopefully each and every one of you after this. Thanks, everyone.